Finally, this and every edition of Bang the Book Radio is presented by DSI Sportsbook. If you head on over to DSI, use that promo code BTB and the number 25. You get a $25 free bet just for signing up. 100% deposit match bonus for the sportsbook and 100% deposit match bonus for the live casino as well. At BetDSI, it's only a game until you bet it. Two guests join me here today. The first, Mr. Brad Powers from BradPowersSports.com. Brad, how's it going today, man?
It's going well. Good to hear your voice on this fine Thursday morning.
All right, well, we've been covering some different topics here with our handicappers throughout the week, and when I get a topic in my head, when I start talking about it here on the show, I like to crowdsource opinions, get as many of them as I possibly can. So go ahead and get yours here today on the show, Brad. And one of the things that I like to refer to the month of November as in college football is kind of the appetizer. You know, it's a little bit before the bowl season where you've got a different set of handicapping considerations. So let me ask you this. In terms of your power ratings here in the month of November with about 3 weeks left of the regular season, how much stock are you putting in them?
Not as much because me being a handicapper, you got to have some plays out there. And, the difference being, compared, this time of year compared to the early start of the year, on a card, maybe I would have at the start of the year 7 to 10 games where, I could just go off of pure power ratings plays where the difference was, a couple points compared to my power ratings. Compared to this time of year, even though in the rotation you probably have 10 more games, teams aren't on buys and all that, and you're not having teams playing FCS opponents, I might have like 5 games a week. And a lot of times those games, maybe there's a key injury that's not being fully grasped in the power rating later in the week, or maybe it's just a team that's getting pounded as a big favorite. That kind of skews the line a little bit. A big favorite, what I mean by that is like by more than 4 touchdowns, where even though there's a difference of 3 points in the power rating, it's just not as much as, a 3-point difference when you got a competitive point spread. So, no, I do not use the power ratings as much. But the one thing, and we're going to talk about it here, the advantage that you do have this time of year, obviously you got a lot of rivalry games. You got teams with bowl needs coming up. And that's where you can really take advantage of what, the last couple weeks of the season, where sometimes you got questionable motivation for one team, and on the other side, you got a very motivated team on the other side.
Yeah, and of course, the biggest motivation here at this time of the year for a lot of these teams is getting bowl eligible. I mean, you have a select number of teams, probably 8 to 10 at most, that are going to have a shot at the college football playoff, but other teams are going to have a chance to go to the bowl games, play in the postseason, get some extra practices, which if you have a young head coach or a group of young players, having those extra bowl practices is very, very significant for you. And we can kind of look at it in the opposite context as well. We think about bowl motivation, getting to 6 wins being really important, and obviously it is. But look at what happened last night to Eastern Michigan. They fall 42-30 to Central Michigan, biggest loss of the year for the Eagles. And now they can't make it to a bowl. They went to a bowl game for the first time since 1987 last year. Now they can't go to one. So you kind of look at them as a team maybe on the flip side here where you can outright question their motivation, and that's something that may not be quantified in a set of power ratings.
No, and moving forward, it was a team that you thought would be up there for winning their last 3 games of the season to try to get back to bowl eligibility. Now, last night was more about turnovers, 5 of them for Eastern Michigan that really set them back. But I'm glad you bring them up because next week a great example of a team that's going to be motivated, being Miami of Ohio, the team that Eastern Michigan plays, who has to win out to get back to a bowl game at home for them. And Eastern Michigan, a young program, let's see how they handle expectations. Didn't necessarily handle them great coming off a bowl last year, but I think a lot of it had to do with close losses and a relatively tough schedule. So, I'm not throwing Chris Creighton and that program in the trash. I thought they might actually be just as good as last year, just the ball didn't bounce their way in a majority of the games, and they played a tougher schedule. But, man, I don't know. If that bubble burst last night and they don't feel like they have much to play for the rest of the season, then no question about it. A power rating is not going to grasp that, and it's going to be a very competitive point spread, I think, on the road in Miami, Ohio. Maybe Miami, Ohio favored slightly. But if they got questionable motivation and Miami is very motivated, the Redhawks will be a play, and I'll definitely be looking to lean with the Redhawks next week when that game's played.
And what's funny is that typically I'm a numbers guy. I mean, I'm a big baseball fan, and baseball is almost exclusively about the numbers for me. And in football, you have situations where you can use the numbers. You obviously want to incorporate that into your total package of a handicap. But quantifying a situation like that to the point spread, it really cannot be done accurately. It's basically what sort of value you personally want to put on it, what it means to you, because there is no right answer. And, you could say that there's no wrong answer, but obviously if you overcompensate for it, then it's probably not the right way to go about it. But, yeah, with a situation like Eastern Michigan, again, you run into this spot where whatever your power rating says is probably what the number is going to come out at or something thereabouts. And then you have to try and figure out, what it actually means to this team to go to a bowl game last year, to not be able to do it this year. So that is something that it can be a little bit uncomfortable for people. And it makes me wonder, Brad, now that we're this deep into the season and you have extracurricular considerations like this that don't show up in power ratings, do you find yourself waiting a little bit more throughout the week, or are you still jumping out at some of those early numbers to try and get line value?
I'm glad you brought this up because, I still try to pick off the ones around key. As far as many bets, do I make as many bets right now down at the Wynn as far as the Vegas openers here compared to what I did weeks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? No. But what I do find myself is jumping on opportunities, picking off hooks around key numbers, specifically if I'm looking to lay 6.5 or pick off plus 7.5. I'm doing a lot more of that. But also, and look, not everyone's able to do this, but if you're not fully sure what the motivation is going to be for a team, sometimes the great thing about this industry, it's evolved, and maybe the in-game live wagering is the way to go, where you can pretty much figure out if that team is motivated or not by the first couple of drives of the game. Now, you'll be paying a little bit of a premium there, but if there's anything questionable and you're not fully sure, that's the advantage that you have over a bookmaker. Number one, they got the advantage of you got to lay 110 to beat them. But the advantage that you have over them is you don't have to play. And sometimes if you're not fully sure what the motivation is going to be, your power rating is relatively close, then I would say wait until game day, wait until the game's played, and you fully can see yourself a lot of time early on in that first quarter whether this team came to play or not. But as far as I go, a little bit less betting for me. It's more strategic betting around key numbers and trying to anticipate line moves. And the great thing about late in the year is you kind of got a feel for where the market's going to move on a lot of teams.
And it's really interesting because typically with my college football, I do very well early in the season because I've done a lot of preseason work. I've written preview content and done these preseason preview shows and that type of thing. In the middle of the year, I get some valleys. Things kind of, there's sort of a reversal of fortunes there. And then late in the year, I think that I tend to pick things up and do a little bit better because, baseball is really truly the only sport where I handicap strictly based on the numbers. When it comes to the NBA and the NHL, I'm looking at a lot of situational factors. It's the same thing here late in the year for college football. And then obviously, of course, once we get into bowl season, and we'll talk about every bowl game here with our guests on the shows. But, I think it's a good spot for our listeners as well who, maybe don't do power ratings, maybe aren't as invested in the numbers as some people are, but you have so many other things here that you can handicap with to where you don't necessarily have to know the personnel. You don't necessarily have to know, how that team is played on a yards per play standpoint or whatever else. You can just look at these handicaps as what they are, as, take a situation like Old Dominion, for example. They play FIU this week. FIU's got a shot to go to a bowl game. They actually have bowl eligibility, for the first time in a long time. And they're trying to set new standards for this program. Old Dominion went to its first bowl game last year. They were a 10-win team last year. They need to win out this year to get to a bowl game. But this is a team that if they lose on Saturday and they go to 3-7, the best they can do is 5-7. They're not going to a bowl game. They've been destroyed by injuries on both sides of the ball. They've got a good head coach in Bobby Wilder, but it's been a long year with a lot of guys dinged up. And all of a sudden, a team like Old Dominion, you can circle them and say, okay, I want to play against them. And it's different now at this time of the year. You really can't do that early on in the season.
No, you can't because, let's face it, teams aren't waving very few. Out of the 130 teams, maybe you see a couple that wave the white flag early on in the season, whether it be mid-October, maybe it's they already got an interim coach and the season's over with. But one thing that does happen is those 2 or 3 teams late November when it comes to the final couple weeks of the season that grows to maybe 35, 40 teams that might be just playing out the season. And that's the advantage of, handicapping late November. In addition to all the other sports that are going on, I think sometimes creates a softer market. And I'm glad you brought up how you do as a handicapper. I'm exactly the same way. I do well early on. I don't know what it is with me in the month of October. I'm just maybe overthinking things, but I'm not very good in October. But usually late November, I fully pounce on some of these unique opportunities where, even though I'm a pure numbers guy to begin with, I'm also been following the game for the last 25, 30 years, and you're dealing with 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. And I've seen in the past where, the interest level just isn't there in the last couple of weeks of the season. A lot of times the interest level is really there on the other side. And, again, the markets they get it to a certain extent, but they don't always compensate for that, which could be, a 3-4 point type of factor in a particular game.
All right, well, let's look at some of these games here that we want to go a little bit more in-depth on, and let's go to Friday night. We'll talk about Washington and Stanford. Washington, a 6-point road favorite in Palo Alto, and this is a big one for the Pac-12 because Washington is the only team at this point that can make it into the college football playoff. Everybody else has 2 losses, including USC, including Washington State. So right now it's Washington or bust because the only conference that's probably going to get a 2-loss team in there ever would be the SEC. This is a huge game for Washington going out. It's a bit of a revenge game for Stanford as well. Now, for those, obviously nobody knows this, but we did wind up recording about 20 minutes of a previous segment here for today's show. Then we had an audio issue. The audio cut out. Then we had to start from scratch again. So, Brad, first of all, thank you for being patient there with that. But you did make a grab on Stanford early on in the week at a number that's no longer available.
Yeah, I did, and here's a great example of what I'm doing this time of year, particularly down there on Sunday at the Wynn at the Vegas openers for the upcoming week of college football. I saw a line Stanford plus 7.5, and I'm like, well, I'll take the hook there. Even though my power ratings has this game, right around 6, maybe a little bit less, not a significant difference, but right through a key number. And I wanted to play on Stanford, particularly off a loss against Washington State. And why did I want to play Stanford off a loss? Especially when they were slightly favored. Well, they're 11-0, straight up 11-0 against the spread after suffering an outright loss as a favorite dating back to the Harbaugh era. They're also extremely good as a home underdog. It hasn't been the case in the last 4 years because they haven't been a home underdog in 4 years. But, take it back to, again, the Harbaugh era, 7-0 against the spread as a home dog, 6 outright upsets the last 3 times, all outright upsets over top 10 teams. It's been a tough season for them. Defensively, they're just not what they were 2-3 years ago. I thought you had a beautiful stat there with Sports Cheetah, the fact that they're giving up more yards per rush as far as yards per carry than they were giving up yards per play just a couple years ago. That's an incredible stat, but I had to play the Cardinal just by not only pure numbers at plus 7.5, but I love the trends that are in my favor, and I even think the situation's in my favor here. Even at the current plus 6 number, I still lean with the Cardinal. And on the flip side, the jury's still out on Washington. I mean, they played arguably the weakest schedule so far for a Power 5 team, them and Wisconsin. They haven't played a single team in the top 40 of my power ratings right now, and the highest-ranked team that they played was Arizona State, who's in my mid-40s. And they lost the game outright as a double-digit favorite on the road. So, yes, they're number 1 in the country in total defense, and they've, smashed some teams here as of late, but I still don't know how good Washington is. And the fact that I have, some questions out there in mid-November, I had to take the Cardinal and, again, still lean with them at plus 6.
And this circles back to a game I talked about on Wednesday's show with Brian Leonard, the Toledo-Ohio game. My number on that game was Ohio plus 2. The number came down throughout the week, closed plus 3, even as high as minus 125 on the Juice at Bookmaker. So that thing really moved towards my number. Didn't play Ohio. They win 38-10, of course. But the reason I didn't play Ohio is because, I mean, who have they played? They hadn't played anybody of Toledo's caliber, and then they come out and have a really big game in that spot. So now you walk into a situation with Washington and Stanford here. Stanford's played some very good teams in some tough environments. Washington has played virtually nobody. So it's tough when you get this late into the year here in Week 11 where we don't know about a team. But if you don't know about Washington and you got a pretty good handle on Stanford, I think you're on the right track here with the play that you made.
Yeah, again, as far as Stanford goes, taking it, if you're concerned about what you've seen from them the last couple of weeks, the Oregon State game, chalk it up. You don't have Bryce Love. Last week, back-to-back road games against a good Washington State team, particularly Washington State's really good at home. I mean, it was played in 35-degree temperatures, flurries. Bryce Love's ankle, in my opinion, looked like it tightened up after the long touchdown run early. Don't be as concerned. I mean, you definitely have to have some reservations about Stanford compared to past editions, but I still think that they're a legitimate top 25 team. And if that's the case, Washington hasn't played a legit top 25 team at all. And the fact that they're laying a touchdown on the road says Stanford clearly the play.
All right, well, let's move to Saturday here. Let's go to game 159, 160 in the rotation order. This one, TCU and Oklahoma. Oklahoma pretty much a 6.5-point favorite across the board. Couple sevens at some of the more public shops, 5 dimes in Bovada. But the 7 at 5 dimes coming with +7 -130 on the dogs. So that's effectively a 6.5 line. They're just playing a little bit of teaser protection and things of that sort there with that one. But you have this situation here where Oklahoma, coming off of a bedlam rivalry game against Oklahoma State, won that game 62-52. They're taking on a TCU team that is one of 2 in the Big 12 that can actually play some defense. The other being Iowa State. Well, one of 3, I guess. The other being Iowa State and then another being Texas. But for TCU here, I mean, look, their offense isn't particularly great. It's not particularly strong, but they do something that very few teams in this conference do, and they're getting 6.5 points to play it at a high level.
Yeah, and the defense. I got not only am I getting about a touchdown here, but I have not only the better defense, but the much better defense. I mean, the Horned Frogs incredibly. This is Big 12 action here. Last 4 conference games have allowed 7 points per game. Last week they hand Tom Herman his first ATS loss in the underdog role in his coaching career. As long as Kenny Hill is protecting the football, I could almost make a case that maybe TCU's a little bit better than Oklahoma, at least from what I've seen so far this year. And one thing I haven't heard anyone talk about, looking at the marketplace this year, is Bedlam has always been played the last game of the regular season. This year they move it up. Maybe there's anticipation that there's a rematch in the Big 12 title game. But one thing we can finally chart now is how do those 2 teams play after such a big rivalry game? And me personally, I want to play particularly how that game played out last week. Shootout down to the wire. Both teams running up and down the field, a lot of plays. I want to play against both teams here, and particularly TCU having the much better defense in a better spot. And they're in their preferred underdog role on the road as a dog, 13-3 against the number. I like TCU a lot. Shame on me for not catching an early number, although it wasn't there at the win. It was 6.5 on Sunday. But I think clearly the right play. And the only thing preventing me from having, top play of the week material on TCU here is I haven't had a good pulse on TCU. I've backed them a few times. It's been their 2, subpar performance of the season. They get outplayed at home against West Virginia, even though they get a straight-up win. They don't cover. And then a couple weeks ago on the road at Iowa State, Kenny Hill has 3 turnovers, his worst game in the entire season, and they get beat outright in that one. So the fact that I haven't had a good pulse on TCU prevents me from going all in, but I definitely think they're the right side here.
Well, and of course, too, you talk about that odd situational spot coming off the Bedlam game, and that's something Oklahoma doesn't do. You also have a situation of Lincoln Riley coming off of a really big win, and he's a first-year head coach. Now, I know they came off of the Ohio State game and played very well, but that was against Tulane. The following week, they really struggled on the road at Baylor, and as we know, Baylor's not a very good team this year, and then lost to Iowa State. So you look at Oklahoma here, and you kind of wonder, can Lincoln Riley get this team back in the mix, especially when he's at a coaching disadvantage, because Gary Patterson remains one of the most underrated coaches in the country. I know TCU was bad last year, but this year they're right back on track. They're right where they're supposed to be. And it's certainly a very interesting spot here for Oklahoma. Now, I will ask you this, Brad. Obviously, you're leaning towards the TCU side. As I mentioned, there's a couple of 7s out there, both of them at a little bit higher juice. Where do you think this number goes? I mean, is this going to be one of those pros versus Joes types of games where maybe the guys that wait a little bit with the influential money can catch a 7 on game day?
Yeah, I think you'll be able to maybe catch a 7 on game day. Looking at the betting splits, looks like, Oklahoma's the preferred public side here. I don't think it's overwhelming, and I definitely think the pro money is going to be on TCU. I would wait. I think there's opportunity. Maybe at some square shops here, and if you're listening in Vegas, stations being maybe the most square, they can maybe pick off a 7. But I don't see it moving. I think it closes right around this 6.5. If anything, it probably moves down. I do think TCU is the preferred side, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised on game day. You get a rogue 7 out there at a public shop, but I don't know if it's going to last long because we've seen it already. Those 7s out there are not going to last long unless they're juiced, like you mentioned, at 5 dimes being minus 130. I definitely don't see it going north of 7. It's not going right back through 7. I'll put it that way. I'm very confident in that.
All right, well, I know I didn't send this game over to you in our notes here before the show, but since we talked about the Bedlam rivalry, I do want to touch on this game here real quickly. Game 161-162 between Oklahoma State and Iowa State. Oklahoma State, 6.5-point road chalk for this trip to Ames. There are a couple of 7s out there as well. But, for Oklahoma State here, I mean, not only did they lose the rivalry game last week, but they lost their chances of hoping to do something more because now they're a 2-loss team. And you kind of wonder, I mean, Mike Gundy's a really good head coach, but you kind of wonder what the mindset is of this team here for this week. Meanwhile, you have this Iowa State team. Yeah, they're only 6-3. Yeah, they've lost a couple of games they probably shouldn't have. But, man, are they dangerous in the role that they're in this week?
No question. And number one, for me, this is one of my favorites, defensive home underdogs. One of my favorite personal handicapping philosophies is to back them because it's quite simple for me. You have the better defense. You don't give up many points. You're getting points, and you're at home. So this is one that usually shows up, especially the last 3-4 weeks of the season. And you talk about motivation. I'm worried. I think Oklahoma State's got questionable motivation off that big-time game against Oklahoma where they come up just short. They're driving. They're down 3 late. Don't get the job done. They got 2 losses. The national championship for them pretty much all done, and maybe even the Big 12 title chances all done for them. Now, Iowa State's also coming off a loss, but I got to be honest with you. I was very impressed with them. They didn't roll over and die last week where they could have. They were in a tough spot on the road in Morgantown after a couple of big wins. They're down 20-0, but kudos. The tip of the cap goes to that entire program and Matt Campbell. I mean, they fight right back tooth and nail in that game, only lose the game 20-16, shut down West Virginia in the second half. So with the better defense and the more reliable team as far as motivation, Cyclones are the pick for me.
I'm really glad you brought that point up, and this is something that I think people need to realize. And if people take anything away from these shows here, I think that we have a lot of great bits of advice and a lot of things that can really help in the long term. And that's what I want people to take away. But not every loss is a bad loss. That is an extremely good loss for Iowa State last week. To fight back, yeah, they started slow. That wasn't a big surprise at all that they started slow. I honestly thought that West Virginia was going to cover that number comfortably last week, given the spot, given that Iowa State has expectations as a ranked team that they haven't had in many, many years. And to go out there and yeah, they gave up a lot of yardage, but they played well in the second half. They fought back, like you said. They showed a lot of tenacity, and that's important. That's something you can build on because, Matt Campbell can look at his players and say, hey, guys, look, not only were we not supposed to win that game, we weren't supposed to be all that competitive in that game, and we were. And you know what we've done at home, so let's go back home and do it. And I think that's one of those losses where people just kind of gloss over it and bypass it. But I think it means a lot more when you actually take a deep dive into it than what it would suggest on the surface. So I'm glad you brought that point up, and I agree. Those are the games, honestly, that mean the most to me, is when you see a team in a horrible spot that still goes out there and plays really competitive and even gives themselves a chance. That means a lot and goes a long way in my book. No, not all losses are created equal, and that's why it's very important to take a look at the box scores. I know a lot of people don't have time to do that, but it's one thing that I do every single game. Don't be a final score reader. A lot of times, to dive in there and see how the game played out. In that particular case, I don't know if there was, maybe a loss that I came more impressed with the team than last week. And the markets were against them, blew right through 3, and obviously they still didn't cover. But, man, that to me says growth in a program there. And it also, projects forward for me the fact that this season's not over for them, even though they got 3 losses. They're still fighting, scrapping, and they still have the same identity that they had and the chip on their shoulder
before they, traveled to Norman, Oklahoma and pulled off one of the biggest upsets of the year.
All right, so this next game here that we're going to talk about, it kind of has some significant implications, and that's nice to see because it's Notre Dame and Miami, game 165, 166 on the board. Notre Dame, 3-point road favorites in South Florida. A big, big game for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Me being a more of a lifelong Notre Dame fan, I'll be a little bit nervous heading into that one. But, looking at it, elimination game for Notre Dame, I don't see them, no shot with 2 losses, especially not having a conference championship to strive for. So it's win or go home for them. On the flip side, Miami, obviously unbeaten. Miami team that I thought was extremely overrated entering last week, but kudos to them. The first time that they're, kind of disrespected. We're depending on, early in the week they were a home underdog. They flipped the favorite, but I thought they showed a little bit of tenacity and something I haven't seen from them all year. They stepped up to the level of competition and took it to Virginia Tech. Notre Dame, a little bit of concerns for the first time all season. I thought the defense had a lack of focus last week, and maybe it's because they were up big. But I got backdoored backing the Irish last week, and I even came out strongly on the show on that one. So I apologize to anyone that tailed me a little bit there, getting backdoored by allowing 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. But that was a little bit concerning in the fact that they gave up 587 yards. But I'll chalk it up as, just them a little bit, coming off 2 big performances against NC State and USC and being up big. Yeah, maybe they lost a little bit of focus. But, number one factor for me, and let me first say that I did bet Miami early in the week plus 3.5. Again, that's just me taking a hook. It's not, me saying, Miami's one of my top plays of the week. I just thought, for me, I'll take the hook. It's right around a key number. Had Notre Dame been minus 2.5 at the win, I might have laid it with Notre Dame. I think the line currently at 3 is real sharp. For me, I'm going to lean towards the under. I think Miami's defense is the best Notre Dame's seen since the Georgia game, and we saw their offense struggle on that one. And on the flip side, I think Notre Dame's focus is back on the defensive side of the ball, a team that hasn't allowed more than 20 points all season prior to the Wake Forest game. I'm going under 57.5 in a big-time ball game here. That's my current, as far as the best value goes. But let's be honest, it's one of the bigger games of the week. And a lot of times, unless the narrative out there is completely wrong, I usually don't find the tremendous amount of value on the bigger games of the week.
One thing I am kind of curious to see here in this spot is, a lot of people were down on Miami. They had the close win over Florida State where they basically won it at the buzzer. Same thing against Georgia Tech. They played some really close games here. They had a ton of trouble with a decimated North Carolina team on the road, and then looked like the team that they're supposed to be, the ceiling that they have in that game against Virginia Tech. One of the things that concerns me in a spot like this with a team that's had the body of work that Miami has, to do that 2 weeks in a row, to bring your A game, I hate to use stupid cliches like that, but to bring your max effort back-to-back weeks against teams that are as good or better than you is really hard to do. And that's my concern here with Miami in this game.
Yeah, definitely is. And, it's a young team with Mark Richt, obviously in the second year, and they got a young quarterback. And their entire linebacker core is a bunch of sophomores. How do they handle the expectations of a big game? Now, Notre Dame had a down season last year, but they've been in a lot of these big games for the last 4 years, particularly on the road. ACC, go back to the Florida State game from years ago, a couple years ago, Clemson on the road in a big. I would trust them more in this spot than what we've seen from Miami. But, I wonder if Miami's upside is a little bit greater than Notre Dame because, maybe they're just finally getting it together, being a young team, young program, and we finally saw them break through last week against Virginia Tech. So that's actually a question that I have. Maybe that they finally, they kind of faked it until they made it by getting close wins over Florida State, Georgia Tech, even Syracuse and North Carolina. And then finally the light bulb clicked on for them last week against Virginia Tech. And maybe that's the real team moving forward. But, again, I'm not for certain about that. And that's why, I would only bet them at plus 3.5 and not at the current 3 number. I'm not overwhelmingly, positive as far as, looking at their entire season. To me right now, Virginia Tech looks like an outlier. I just think there's a possibility that the light bulb finally clicked on. Again, another question of why I'm not going to get too involved from this point forward unless the line comes down.
And one more question here about this game, and I don't know if we can necessarily answer this with a one-game sample size, but, Mark Richt, who regularly won 9 or 10 games at Georgia, was dismissed from Georgia largely because he couldn't win that big game. He couldn't put that team in a position to where they could go to the SEC championship game, to where they could knock off Alabama or LSU or whoever they wound up playing in those spots. This is really his first exceptionally big game at Miami here, I think, just because of the college football playoff implications that are in play as well. So I'm kind of curious to see what sort of steam that narrative draws as we get closer to kickoff.
That's a great point. It means a heck of a lot to Mark Richt here to finally get over the hump, but I also think it means a heck of a lot to Brian Kelly. He hasn't won a big game like this, particularly on the road, since probably the 2012 Oklahoma game. And Oklahoma turned out a little bit to be a fraud by the end of the season, losing a total of 3 games. So I think both coaches here who have struggled in big-time games, one's really going to move forward with a lot of positive momentum. The other, the questions are going to remain. But, I think Mark Richt probably gets a little bit of a flyer here, the fact that it's only his second year, and there's tremendous amount of energy down there in South Florida with this program. So as long as he's not getting crushed in this game, I don't know if it necessarily, is a negative moving forward. For Brian Kelly in his 8th season at Notre Dame, if he can't win this one, especially being favored, then the question definitely becomes, is he ever going to get Notre Dame over the hill as far as being a legitimate national title contender year in and year out?
All right, one more game I want to touch on with you here for college, and we'll talk NFL for a few minutes. And this game is effectively handicapping 101 in terms of this is probably the most basic handicap you're going to find, at least on the surface. And then as you start digging a little bit deeper into the material, you find that this one has more complexity to it than you originally thought. Game 185-186, Iowa takes on Wisconsin. Iowa opened a 13.5-point favorite. It's moved down to the 11.5 or 12 range. None of those numbers all that significant. But a lot of people look at this game and say, okay, Iowa beat Ohio State. They didn't just beat Ohio State last week. They hammered Ohio State last week. Wisconsin now looks like the Big Ten's best hope to make it into the college football playoff, if not the only hope that the conference has. But they've played virtually nobody to this point in the year. Is this the right line move on this game?
Yeah, I do think so. And Iowa's consistently played up to these ranked teams last 4 seasons, 8-2 against the spread. They've beaten against AP top 25 teams, and they've beaten the spread, the closing spread, by an average of 2 touchdowns per game. And look, if you're worried, hey, they're going to have a letdown spot, last year they beat number 2 Michigan at home, and the next week shut out Illinois 28-0, and right after that, hammered Nebraska. So they kind of used that win over Michigan to finish their regular season very strong. Wisconsin hasn't played anybody yet. Maybe Northwestern's the only conference team they faced with a winning record, and that game they didn't cover. So I think it's the correct line move, but I'll be honest with you, Adam, something kind of, and this, even a game we're not talking about, Ohio State, Michigan State, something just doesn't smell right to me. It kind of seems like, those 2 dogs, Iowa and Michigan State, are almost popular public underdogs, and that's something that I never want to fully jump in on. Everything makes sense from a numbers aspect, the fact that those 2 teams look and appear to be the right side, but, Wisconsin's kind of been meandering, and you can say, hey, they haven't played anybody yet, but they also, are really fresh and focused, and maybe they're capable of really putting it on an Iowa team here. So I'm not going to get too involved. I do think the Iowa is a preferred side, obviously getting more than 10. I would lean that way. But believe it or not, I'm not going to get too involved. I'm a little concerned that Iowa, we'll see how they handle expectations off a 50-point cover. Anytime a team covers by 50 points, I usually like to fade them the next week. It's just that their upside, especially against ranked opponents, has been so overwhelmingly strong. They just play up to the level of their competition.
I know we talked about a few games that you have some opinions on. Before we transition over to the NFL side, are there any games out there that you want to throw out as an exclusive free pick for our listeners?
Yeah, I love Duke this week. I love the situation. I love their matchup against the option. If you're playing the option, first thing I want to know is, do you have experience defending the option? Well, Duke has that experience. You look at them against Georgia Tech, Navy, and Army the last 3 years. They're 6-0 against the spread against option teams. Last year, Duke held Army to their second lowest rush yards of the season. And then you look at motivation here. Duke desperate, 4-5. They got to get to bowl eligibility. They're off 5 straight losses. And they have extra time to prep. They're coming off a bye week to prep for the option. On the flip side, Army's off their biggest win over Air Force in probably 2+ decades. They shut them out 21-0. Duke is great in non-conference action as far as a technical aspect. They're 18-4 against the spread versus non-conference opponents. We got the matchup here, Duke against the option situation. They're off a bye, Army off a big win. Technical in our favor. Duke Blue Devils, best bet for me, -3.
I like it. I like that a lot. Very strong case there. My number was a decent amount higher in that game as well. So, that one at 1.5 looked like a good power ratings. Talk about all the situational elements and all the other things that are going in our favor. And I think it's a good one there for our listeners. So let's go over to the NFL side here for a couple of minutes. And before we look at some specific games here, Brad, I want to touch on this with you. This has to have been a frustrating couple of weeks for you in the NFL because favorites are doing very well, and it feels like all the trendy dogs are the dogs that are actually covering.
Yeah, it's been the last couple of weeks a little bit frustrating. There's no doubt about that, particularly last week. If the public's doing well in the NFL, that usually means Brad Powers not doing well. I'm very, more than any other sport, I'm contrarian when it comes to the NFL because it's the most bet sport, and I tend to find value being contrarian, whether it's fading a popular public underdog or fading that ever popular favorite here. And it also, the old backdoor cover doesn't help old Brad Powers sports when you got Tennessee in hand last week as a top play of the week and a touchdown with less than a minute left or even a missed extra point early in the game kind of cost you in that one. So last week was not one of my favorite weeks as far as the NFL goes. There's no doubt about that. But more often than not, when the dust settles, I think if you're a contrarian in the NFL, you can win consistently year after year.
Couple of games I want to talk about with you here, and the first one is the Packers and the Bears. And what's fascinating about this game is in the lines that came out at CG Technology when they released all the games for the first 16 weeks of the season, this number was Packers -6.5. Now this week, this number is Bears -6. And look, I get it. Aaron Rodgers is out, and obviously he's a significant adjustment to the line. But the Packers have looked so bad without him that all of a sudden you have this Bears team with Mitch Trubisky and an offense that can't really do a whole lot as a 5.5, 6-point favorite. It's just amazing how quickly things can adjust.
It is. And not only that, but you look at the past history here. I mean, this is the first time Chicago's been a favorite over Green Bay since 2008. I mean, 18 meetings. This is the first time they've been favored here. And Green Bay earlier this year won 35-14. Now, a lot of it had to do with 4 Chicago turnovers. Obviously, Rodgers out since then. Chicago's moved to Mitch Trubisky. But I think the situation favors Chicago here. They're off a bye. Green Bay's traveling on a short week. That was a pathetic, feeble performance against Detroit. I mean, they're off a bye. They get Detroit at home. They got an extra week to prep with Hundley at quarterback. And you put that kind of effort out there on national television. What a joke that was. And look, the Bears have been, kind of poor favorites under John Fox, 0-5 straight up and 0-5 against the spread. But this team has a little bit of a different feel. They're 4-0 against the spread at home this year, and I can make the case that they could have won all those games outright against playoff teams. The Atlanta game, they drop a touchdown pass. They beat Pittsburgh outright. They beat Carolina outright, even though they benefited from a couple of defensive touchdowns. The Minnesota game was close. Look, I'm not going to have a strong play of the week on Chicago laying less than a touchdown here, but this is one earlier in the week I wasn't thinking about too strongly, but after that Green Bay performance, and the more I think about it, I mean, Brett Hundley is just not an NFL quarterback. Give me the Bears here, minus the points, believe it or not. I think they're clearly the right side.
Yeah, and you also have this injury situation for Green Bay. Balaga's out for the year now. They've had multiple guys in the back seven on defense run into injury problems as well. And one of the things that's hard about this game, though, is that you look at the total of 38, you look at the spread of 5.5 or 6, and I think you got to start asking yourself, how many points do I actually need Chicago to score to cover this game? Honestly, if they get 17, 20, it's very difficult to see them not covering this number because their defense has been really, really good here. Vic Fangio's doing some great work here in his third year. You've got this Green Bay offense that just can't do anything right now. They're very one-dimensional running the football. But mentally, and this is something that's really hard about the NFL in general, mentally you have to get over that hurdle of looking at Chicago at 3-5 with, 134 points scored in 8 games. You have to get over that mental hurdle of laying 6 with them, because sometimes it just makes sense. And that's not to say I'm going to use it for the Super Contest or anything like that, but really there's only one way you can go in this game.
And for me, it's Chicago or nothing. If you don't want to lay 6, I understand, but I'll be honest with you, you do not want Green Bay right now. I think it's a toxic situation. You mentioned the injury to Balaga, the tackle, and I think a lot of the players that are playing hurt might end up being, injured all of a sudden, because I don't think there's much to play for. And all of a sudden, Green Bay there. I mean, what's the atmosphere there when you're not winning in Green Bay? Is that the place that you're really happy to be in the winter? When you got Aaron Rodgers under center, then everything's well. You're winning and everyone's happy there in Packerland. But when you're losing and there's no hope, boy, that could be a long next 6-7 weeks there up there in the frozen tundra. To me, I just cannot. You cannot talk me into having a Green Bay ticket after that Detroit performance. That was one of the worst performances I've seen all year from a team.
Now, I don't want to go down a massive rabbit hole here, but I do want to ask you about this because it just came to me, and I'm sure I'll forget by next week to ask you. You've got this Green Bay team that's 4-4 now. They're 2 games back in the division. They're, a game or so back in the wild card, but obviously their situation is very dire without Aaron Rodgers. But that is a team that has experienced success, knows what it's like to go to the playoffs and to win in the playoffs. You also have one in the AFC here in the Denver Broncos, who are now 3-5. They haven't won a game on the road. They have all these quarterback issues. They're talking about going with Paxton Lynch the second he's able to play, which, kind of illustrates the problems that they're having. But we talked about it from a college football standpoint in terms of teams that can no longer make a bowl game. At what point do you start selling some of these NFL teams that have had success, have gone to the playoffs, and their prospects look pretty grim?
Yeah, I mean, look, you would like to think that they're pros. They're getting paid millions of dollars, and you would like to think that they give 100% effort. And I do. Look, for anyone that says that the pros aren't giving 100% effort, if you're not giving 100% effort, you get hurt. The game is so fast, and if you're not, playing 100%, then I think there's a good chance that you get hurt. Now, I don't think, as far as, the 100% factor, as far as motivation and all that, is the preparation heading into the week. That sometimes can be questionable, or maybe you're just not fully paying attention in your team meetings. Maybe you don't have full focus out there on the practice field. And I got to think, if Denver gets rolled up in a big spot at home on Sunday Night Football against New England, I think the possibility is definitely out there. Boy, if they move to 3-6 with 5 straight losses, 5 straight non-covers, I did, even with one of the better defenses in the National Football League, I'm not going to have too many Denver Bronco tickets on my card, particularly you look at the last 6 weeks where they have 4 road games out of the last 6. To me, I'm not afraid to do it even in the professional leagues to start fading a team because, with a first-year coach, it'll be very interesting to see how they handle it. And I think as far as the markets will be against them, and I think, if you're just thinking at it logically, I don't think there's much hope for Denver if they don't put forth a good performance here against the Pats on Sunday.
One more game I want to touch on with you here, Brad, and here's one where we're going to have 2 very motivated teams with good efforts coming here. Game 263, 264 on the board. The New Orleans Saints take on the Buffalo Bills. This number is 3 with extra juice or 2.5 out there with extra juice on New Orleans. So it's all about shopping around here for the best price that you can find if you're invested in this game. But, Brad, like I said, these are 2 teams with a lot to play for here this week. Saints currently lead the NFC South by a half game. Bills, they're a game behind the Patriots, but they're right there in the thick of the wild card race, and it certainly looks like teams like Baltimore, teams like Miami, maybe even the Oakland Raiders could have some issues here going forward. So this is a really significant game, and I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, actually, I'm not a fan of the Bills because I think they benefited from being, one of the best turnover teams in the NFL so far this season. So, moving forward on a game-by-game basis, I'm not going to be on the Bills too much, but I do like the spot here. Look, the Saints deserve to get some respect. They've won 6 straight games, all by 8 points or more. Dominated Tampa Bay last week in a 20-point win. Only allowed about 200 yards on the defensive side of the ball. But you start looking at, hey, who have they played in this dominating stretch, especially at quarterback? Jay Cutler, Brett Hundley, Mitch Trubisky, banged up Jameis Winston. Now, look, Tyrod Taylor isn't great, and he's not my favorite quarterback. but I'd take them over all those guys, particularly a banged-up Jameis, less than 100% Jameis Winston. And Buffalo's upset on the road at the Jets. They got extra time to prep. They're 7-0-1 against the spread versus the NFC. They're 11-4 against the spread as a home dog. And look, it's mid-November. The temperature doesn't look too bad, but it's still mid-November in Buffalo, and things can change in a heartbeat there off the shores of Lake Erie. You know that fully well, being there in Cleveland. New Orleans, obviously a dome team that, past history says doesn't play well out in the cold and that. I like the Bills, and they're one of my top 3 or 4 picks as far as this week, particularly if you're getting that full field goal. Really like the Bills a lot in this one.
I like it. You're doing that whole contrarian thing again because New Orleans is probably going to be the public side here in this spot because I think I like that you prefaced it by saying that Buffalo does look like a little bit of a paper tiger. They have done very well in the turnover department. They've done well in the luck and variance departments. And so they can be a tough team to take. But also, a lot of times the NFL is about those situations. The NFL is about going against those perceptions. And I imagine that there are a lot of people out there that look at New Orleans winning 6 in a row, as you said, all by more than a touchdown. And they're asking themselves, why is this game only 3? Or why is this game 2.5? Generally speaking, at that point in the NFL, you take the other side because there's a reason it's 2.5 or 3.
Oh, yeah. Them books out there that are still dealing, 2.5, to me, they're wanting that New Orleans money there. And look, I think they're kind of setting it up a little bit. But we've seen, now look, they probably had an overwhelming amount of the 2.5. That's why we've seen some books go to the 3 even money there, maybe to get a little bit more action from the Buffalo side. But, yeah, definitely New Orleans is going to be the public side here. And again, after the public's done all right the last couple of weeks, I'm telling you that does not last long in the NFL, especially, the reason they're not building new hotels or at least showing profits here from the book side in Vegas. This might be a good week to be very anti-public and contrarian here this particular upcoming week.
Well, Brad Powers from BradPowersSports.com. What's going on over at the website right now, man?
Yeah, right now, we talk about it each and every week, and I think we have a really good price point out there as far as the Powers Picks newsletter. If you want to get involved, whether you bet a lot or not, but if you just want to understand the entire betting market, the Powers Picks newsletter gets emailed to you each and every Wednesday. It includes, misleading finals from the week before, bad beats, major injuries. We look at the overall records and stuff, trends, also detail, and probably most importantly, detailed write-ups and picks on every single college football game. It doesn't matter if it's the Crimson Tide or the Jaguars from South Alabama. You get a full game write-up on every single game. Also the NFL, power ratings, you name it, it's in there. It's $49, not for this week, not for this month, but for the rest of the season, postseason, all the way through the Super Bowl. $49, BradPowersSports.com.
And you can follow Brad on Twitter at Brad Powers and the number 7. Brad, like I said, our listeners don't know that you and I had about a good 20 minutes of a previous recording done here. Had to start things over from scratch. So, man, I really do appreciate your patience with me today. Thank you so much for that, and I'll talk to you again next week, bud.
Hey, sounds good. Appreciate you, man. I look forward to talking to you next week. Take care.